Thanks, Andre and Julia, and for the kind invitation, I think. I got the email, I think it was last August or September, and I said, I have nothing to do in January. Sure, I'll give this talk. Anyway, it's a real honor to be invited to speak to you because we all know about the importance of this talk and the ability to communicate, ideas and I think in a relatively informal setting about what goes on. So again, Julia and Andre, thank you so much. I wanted to, when they talked to me about data, and the importance of data, I started thinking, well, okay, let me just tell you, it's like Andre said, I've been working a lot on models and numerical models, so I thought I'd tell you about my vast experience with collecting data. And these are my 2 data points of me collecting data. So the picture on the right, or the left, sorry, is me here like 3 months before I finished my PhD here. And this was up in the Foss Lakes, and look at how happy I was and everything. I caught these fish up there. And this is in 2016, and this is a sea lion scat. And you can read all kinds of stuff in terms of the career from a graduate student to a science center director in terms of the kind of stuff that we have to deal with. You can use this picture in a number of ways. I just wanted to say that there is an R² of 1 between the 2 data points. And in terms of hands-on, I just do want to point out that I'm actually not touching the data. So I think that I need to correct that as well. So that is this is it. Now you've seen everything I've done with data in my life. Moving into this, and I'm sorry, I think I probably have too many slides because as they say, we all wish we had had time to make things shorter. But the point of the talk, in terms of what Julia and Andre asked me to talk about, is do we need data or not for decision making in fisheries? And then they said, well, it's a provocative talk, to push new ideas. And this year's focus is why do we need data to help us get there being sustainable fisheries. So I did what any normal person would do, which then you rethink, is to go and talk to your colleagues and say, hey, I got to give this talk, what should I do? Or what should I say? And so the answer to the question is, do we need data to help us get there, is plotted here. It's a perfect uniform distribution. Some people said yes, some people said no, some people said maybe, and then most of the questions were, what was the question again? And I think it does reflect the idea that it's a very, like I said, it's a provocative question in terms of do we need data to get there. But I did get a lot of help from a lot of folks, and I want to thank all you guys. There's lots of you in the audience who helped out. And so I decided in the end to say what I'm going to talk about is going to be based on the answer, it depends. It depends on what it is that you want to do. And that the additional data or information that we need, spans a range of conditions that I'm going to talk about a little bit, maybe providing a framework that I'm going to start looking at it, from the standpoint of looking at single species or stocks. Then I'm going to get a little bit about ecosystem, and then being in a hallowed halls of academia, I'm going to have some musings about truth and what that might be. So the first idea here in terms of data for fisheries, and this is perhaps a simplistic view, and you can look at it from the standpoint of this axis is the status of the stocks, and this is new or additional data needs. And I learned that in biology everything has a Dom curve. So this is a Dom curve in terms of data needs. So when you could argue, roughly that if the stocks are at low levels, well, they're at low levels. I mean, you just know that you need to stop fishing or something. So maybe you don't need as much data. And when the stocks are robust, you may be also saying, well, they're doing fine. Maybe you don't need a whole lot and everything is all right. And it's actually probably somewhere in between, as perhaps the stocks start recovering, as was the case over the past years of many of the stocks recovering, where overfishing and overfishing goes down, and you start straddling that point between going from one side to another is when you need more data if you want to fine-tune what it is that you want to say about the fisheries. So that's just... It is. The mic is only for the recording, I think.
You need to shout, I think is the message I'm getting.
Okay, I will do that. I will shout. So this is just sort of a first cut in terms of when would you need data? And there's extremes when you could say, well, I need less, and there's another case when you try to fine-tune that perhaps you need more. So then this led me to think about, well, if we want to think about how to break it out in terms of the species that we do actually look at, I'm going to talk about 4 different quadrants, and increase in data goes in this direction, and the improvement in assessments or better understanding, I couldn't quite figure out what to call this axis, is going to be the y-axis. And so the 4 are, you could think over here about, you have too little data to provide truly quantitative assessments or robust assessments. You could imagine some cases where you have cases where stocks or species where you increase the data, and perhaps the increase in data may not necessarily give you an improvement with more data, so it could almost be like a diminishing returns. There could be another group here that assessments will clearly improve, or our understanding will clearly improve with more or better data. And then there's other ones over here that you could say the assessments will, we could add, are really good, and in fact we can probably shift some of the attention that we are giving to this group up here, and perhaps start collecting other data that we're not looking at because we sort of are, quote, data rich, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So examples could be, these are data poor stocks, and rockfish come to mind. In terms of perhaps, adding a better or different data, it could be Pacific sardine, because we may have, quote, saturated the current way of doing things. This one, we could keep the methods and what we're doing, but adding more data would probably give us better answers, and I'm going to use some examples of reef fish and Pacific bluefin. And then there's, again, there's never really a data-rich species. I mean, as I said, this is a case where in a relative sense, you could say that we have enough data to deal with stocks that are doing well, and perhaps we can shift some of the effort to look at other things that would help those and other parts of the understanding. So the first one, okay. So I'm going to start by looking at data poor stocks, the California rockfish being an example, and these are stocks where, for example, in California alone, 70% of the stocks are considered data poor. There's a nice paper that I ran into by Honey et al. That does a nice summary of all of this. And these are stocks where, where we suffer from a lack of data, perhaps a lack of reliable data with adequate analysis. So it could be that we have a lot of data, but they're either unreliable or underanalyzed. And the transition out of data poor just naturally or easily translate into, we need more data. We need either to improve the quality of the data, or we need to increase the technical capacity to analyze the data. So that's perhaps an easy one. The second one is a little bit trickier perhaps, and this is the one where I'm giving, for example, the Pacific sardine. Is like, we've collected a lot of data, but it's a very difficult species to perhaps assess in some ways. And the reason is that there's very high frequency changes in the population. It's very responsive to environmental variations. And uncertainty and variability in natural mortality, because there's so many predators on it, make it difficult to really nail it. And so there's so much variability associated with these species that perhaps we might want to think about a different way of either using the data or collecting some data to improve the way that we understand how the species is the health of the species or the populations. And so I just want to talk very briefly of a couple examples of how we look at the sardine presently, and perhaps some small steps that we can do in terms of changing the way that we do the analysis, or we look at them, or we collect data to look at them. That's something that's being considered now in various star panels and such. And so the sardine, generally spawn down in California. They come up north. They feed, and then they come back down again, and they have a cycle, something like that. So they migrate north-south along the west coast, and we have a number of ways of sampling them, and we sample them yearly, and it's a very extensive sample that we've done in various ways in collaboration with the Northwest Center when we also look at hake and so on. The point is that we have a wealth of data here with the sardine. we understand, like I said, the seasonal migration and how we sample, during the time that they're down in the spawning area versus when they're more broadly distributed during sort of their feeding season. And it's really largely based on acoustic sampling. It's acoustic sampling followed by trawls, so it's called the acoustic trawl method. And so the acoustics are multi-frequency, and these acoustics, we're used to either identifying CPS or plankton or hake or krill and so on. And as I said, this is something that we do almost on a yearly basis. It does provide a lot of information, but integrating all that data in a way that perhaps gives us as quantitative an answer as we'd like is something that we're looking at. So the question is, should we continue what we're doing, or can we bring new aspects to bear or new technologies to bear to do this assessment? And so right now we have new ships. The Lasker is one of the recent ships, or the recent ship we've added to the NOAA fleet. We have increased capacity with all these various acoustic technologies. We have the ability to gather, ancillary information in terms of real-time satellite data, et cetera. And we're working towards perhaps, making this much more a much more acoustic, fully acoustic-based survey where, we can take advantage of these measurements and not just look at. And perhaps at the end of a survey, once we've completed the full acoustic survey, we could probably, because we have so much additional data in real time and on board, perhaps by the end of the survey we could actually have an estimate of the biomass, as opposed to doing perhaps a full stock assessment that has been the practice so far. And again, it would probably be on almost on a real-time basis. We would have some kind of an ability to say a little bit more about, or something different about the stock than we have so far. The idea is to expand this a little bit further, to go and consider other components of the ecosystem, krill, squid, et cetera. And this is, again, something that is not something that we're doing yet. It's in discussion. It's something that will have to go through internal discussion within the council process and so on. But I'm just throwing this as an example of, we've been doing certain things certain ways. We've gotten to a point where perhaps we might want to consider a different way of proceeding, and this is an example of how we could take advantage of new technologies and new approaches to perhaps even speed up the process of assessing the status of some stocks. And I just want to point a couple of things, is that we've also realized that the question about the data is also that we've learned that perhaps we're not covering the entire domain in the way that we should have, or that we could, or that we need to. And in particular, one thing that we've noticed is that there's a whole nearshore component of some of the populations that we're missing, and these are indicated in by these little dots over here, where it's too close to shore for the white ships to come in. And this is a picture of an anchovy school off La Jolla. Here's a Scripps Pier. And clearly these are places where perhaps what we're going to have to do is use sort of as I said, these ancillary technologies, or matching what we have in terms of the white ship capabilities and the acoustic capabilities with some work that we can do near shore. And so this is perhaps blending some of the hexacopter work with smaller vessels that are also acoustically upfit that we're using to measure salmon and their predators in the San Joaquin River in the Central Valley, but actually exporting some of these technologies to look at actually complementing what appears to be another part of the population. So this is an example of how it is that we can that these new technologies and this new data can perhaps help what appears to be what I call the data saturated or a place where perhaps we need to rethink how we actually add data to that population, or to understanding that population. The third block is one where we increase data, perhaps keep the methods the same, and examples could be reef fish or bluefin tuna, and in this case, I think the case here is that we're looking at many untrawlable habitats. So you can see the habitats are rugged and difficult to sample. And advanced technologies and improved access to this habitat can both increase perhaps our understanding of the abundance or estimates of the abundance, and probably more size composition than age. But these are, again, cases where we kind of have an idea, but clearly additional data is something that would help us improve where we are. A different case of additional data where we think that help would come in is in highly migratory species. And in this case, I'm perhaps focusing I'll talk a little bit about bluefin tuna, but the biology of these highly migratory species is that they're complicated. They have large spatial boundaries. In the case of bluefin tuna, they cover the whole North Pacific. And the fisheries are complex, so they cover large areas, and the fisheries themselves move. So where the actual fisheries happen also is moving. So there's spatial patterns in not just the fish distribution, but the fishing. And in some ways, this makes it a complex process because of the the fact that it is an international species, so to speak, and assessments are consensus based, and we have to bring a whole different groups of data to the fore in order to make this happen. And just a simple example, bluefin spawns off Asia. It makes a trajectory off Baja California and Southern California, and it spends 2 to 3 years out here. And the point here is that that including data, including movement in the distribution of bluefin, has in some cases, just show a simple example here of the U.S. Eastern Pacific Ocean purse seine fleet in terms of including assessments or estimates, that include movement versus those that don't include movement. So again, it's another example of, what kind of data can we bring to help, do better in terms of understanding, in this case, the highly migratory species. It's a bit complicated because the data. So this is a different level of complication in the sense of, there's no access to a lot of the data. Some of the data is housed in different countries, and actually the data sharing processes and such are things that do require a fair bit of meetings and dialogue. And so some of the strategies forward are to encourage data sharing. That of course will hopefully not just increase the workload, but also allow us to do a little bit to improve on the assessment. So I've gone through various cases here about simply adding data that could be process-based data, or just simply more in the political or the organizational sense of how it is that data is important to have. And then finally, and this is in terms of the quadrant here, I'm talking about stocks that are, quote, data rich. And I put them in quotes because, as I said, they're really, it's hard to be data rich in our business. And the question here is, can we have, can we take advantage of the fact that it's, quote, data rich, and perhaps pay attention to some other things? And in this case, as I said, what do I mean by data rich? And I'm talking about cases that could be data rich relatively because we kind of understand the key intrinsic biological traits. It's, quote, well sampled. Again, relatively, it's a long-lived species, low fishing pressure, et cetera, which results perhaps in a high stable population abundance. So I'm looking again at this end of the dome-shaped curve that I talked about earlier. And so, and again, if you want to compare it with sardine, and I perhaps don't need to show this picture, but these are species that are, and when I say robust, they're nicely in the green area of a Kobe plot, and compared to what the sardine catch is of 100,000 metric tons, these either hake or pollock are well above that. So again, I'm not saying that we should reduce the data because we're doing well by some measures, but perhaps we do have a little bit of flexibility to do that. And the question might be why? Why might you want to do that? And it's because perhaps we're going to anticipate that things will change. And this kind of is leading me into what I'm going to go next in the description of the evolution and data needs that we have. And so, without trying to jump ahead of where I want to go, what we could do is, if we anticipate that there is going to be changes in environmental conditions, if we look at, say, changes in temperature and such, we might want to think about what is going to happen to these species under some of these changes that we anticipate happening. And so the question is, can we shift some of what we're doing and the time and effort that we're doing in the collection of quote, the usual business of collecting data to a different to additional data that might complement some of the questions that we don't have answers to. So getting back to a summary of this, I thought about this in terms of how I would think about how do we collect data and is it needed, and the answer is for different reasons. In each case, we have the need to collect more data. In data poor cases, clearly, I'm not going to say any kind of data, but even a little bit of data may be helpful. In quote, a data saturated case, we might want to look at different kinds of data that complement what we have. And that in some ways, for different reasons, these might be similar in terms of we're shifting the kind of data collection that we have. And then there's this, what I call data enhanced, which are places that we just a little bit more. It's better than data poor, but by adding a little bit more data, we can improve, like was the case, for example, of access to data in the bluefin case, or better sampling some of those untrawlable habitats and so on. So I said, why would we want to shift data collection in places that we might be data rich or otherwise? And this brings me to the fact that we need to start thinking about long-term variability, and we need to think about ecosystem considerations. And if you want to say why should we think about that, I think that two things that come to mind is that if we look out into the next 50 years or so, or the next 30 years, you can think about what if we say, well, in 2050 the population, the human population is going to be about 9 billion, and we need to somehow or another feed that population. And so if you say that we're going to need 50% more food by 2050, and some of it is going to come from the ocean, how are we going to do that? And how can we anticipate those changes are going to be that are going to help us meet that 50% increase in food requirements? And the other one, which is I think perhaps even more powerful, or not even more powerful, is just as powerful, is the fact that not only do we have this challenge in terms of what's happening, but we have this challenge, which is the Earth is what's called is in what's called a no analog state. I mean, over the last 500, compared to the last 500,000 years, the last couple hundred years or so have shown and have seen a range of variability that have moved outside any kind of natural variability that we've seen over that last 500,000 years. And this is just a picture from an article by Will Steffen, where he plots various variables, whether it's CO2 or whether it's methane or ozone depletion or biodiversity and so on. And so the point is that when we look at what's going to happen and what has happened in the Earth system, it is well outside anything we've seen over the last 500,000 years. So for us, my argument would be that for us to think that we're going to be able to continue doing business as usual in the face of these two things may be a little bit optimistic. And so I think we need to think differently in terms of how we're going to do it, and we need to begin to try to understand how this all comes together in an ecosystem context. Because in the end, we know that all of these things are connected somehow, and I'll show some examples. And so it's building on the same idea of in this case I had data. In this case, I'm calling it not just increased complexity and data. In the case of ecosystem approaches, the question here, that axis remains the same, adding new data. Optimistically, we'd say, well, it would be the same dome-shaped curve that as we start over here where we're data poor, and we need, this is a place where we need to add data, or we can be out here where we're going to be so data rich that we're fine, and that would be a case where our process understanding is high and we've been able to reduce uncertainty, and this is probably an optimistic curve that, who knows, maybe we'll get there in several centuries, but most likely over the next few decades or so, we're going to be in this place where additional data is going to be needed as we try to understand, the Earth system in its full complex and evolving stage. So I'm going to go real quickly through the blob. Everybody knows about the blob, and I just want to bring it up because it is such a powerful example of the things that can happen. So these are all images you've seen before, so I'm going to just breeze through them. And the point of the blob is it really did present what's called a climate change, or what some of us refer to as a climate change stress test. I think Nate Mantua and Nick Bond were responsible for really bringing all of this to the fore in terms of us understanding that. And we were, we had the luxury in the Pacific, in the North Pacific, to really see this, to witness this climate change stress test. Just like there were stress tests, in the late, in 2009, 10, 11 with banks, that would look at differences in say, for example, what would happen if interest rates changed, or what would happen if unemployment did X, Y, or Z. What we were able to witness over the last 2 to 3 years is what happens if temperatures rise and remain 2 to 3 degrees above normal for prolonged periods, what happens if stratification changes, what happens if biogeochemistry changes. We saw all of that, happening right in front of us, and it gave us a glimpse in terms of what can happen. And we saw a whole host of things. Again, many of you have seen this before, and we saw that, in a matter of 2 months, over a distance between San Nicolas and say, Monterey, we saw the co-occurrence of widely different warm water and cold water species that we normally don't see. We saw short-bellied rockfish, we saw jellies and salps and pyrosomes, and we saw red crabs. This is being a cold, this is being an offshore, and this being a warm water species, all co-occurring basically here. These are measurements from John Field and other in the Santa Cruz lab. We saw at the same time, we saw the occurrence of bluefin tuna in numbers and distributions that we hadn't seen off Southern California. Also, we saw the presence of false killer whales, again, off our coast. Excuse me, in Southern California, we saw this record harmful algal bloom that really extended all the way up to Alaska. And we saw a whole bunch of other, rather severe impacts on other components of the population. And it really wasn't just at the upper levels. It also started at the base of the food chain, where work by Bill Peterson at the Newport lab, very nicely illustrated that there was a shift even at the base of the food chain when, lipid-rich, and this is one plate. This is a photograph on one plate where you have lipid-rich northern copepods, and you can see the lipid globules, et cetera, were basically substituted by these lipid-poor, if you will, or low lipid contents copepods from the south. So there was almost a change in the energy input into the food chain as a result of some of the changes that we saw. So it was really something that fundamentally altered what we saw, and this is the last slide on this. There was a very nice article in the September issue of National Geographic, which very nicely and very graphically illustrated all the changes that we saw. So the point here was that, my slide about, we're going through some changes, and we also have this food security issue that we have to deal with, kind of talks about we really need to bring all of this, a new level of understanding into what we're doing. And so when John Stein and I and Doug DeMaster talked to the Pacific State Fishery Council or Commission, we talked about the importance of more information to increase certainty in a time of increasing uncertainty. And so, the last 3 years basically threw us for a spin. We hadn't seen this before, and some of the conditions hadn't been there for over 100 years in terms of the records that we have. And so the opportunity and the importance of collecting data to be able to really capture this thing so that we can manage, the processes that are connected at the ecosystem, just again were highlighted and made clear. And so, the things I want to just 2 slides on this thing is that as we move from, business as usual to being able to have, sensors that are distributed in the water column, whether they're gliders or moorings or sensors that can measure, the eDNA of the water column and so on, is something that is upon us. We can do it. These technologies are not sketches. These are technologies that are actually happening, whether it's measuring, through acoustics, the distribution of mesozooplankton, or fish, or optically, not just looking at the acoustic signal, but actually being able to see what's there, is something that is information that we need to collect, and I'm going to argue that we need to collect as we try to put together a new level of understanding of what we're doing. Having said that, there's a caveat that I just want to very quickly talk about here, and that's the exponential data growth that we're dealing with. I mean, we, for example, just on the matter of the increased ship capability that I talked about earlier, the new white ship that we have with the new acoustic capabilities, in the old days, let's say 2014-15, a 90-day cruise generated about 4 to 5 gigabytes of data. The same 90-day cruise will generate 8 terabytes of data per day right now. And so we've got something here to do, and that's just the acoustic signal. You know, if you talk about all the optical stuff and all of that, is going to be a challenge in terms of how we manage it. And in terms of us, in terms of federal, you know, a federal agency and data centers, it's not just going to be a matter of buying more hard drives and how to make this accessible so that everybody has access to it. You know, we're challenged by by other things such as, you know, cybersecurity, statutory compliance, and so on. And this is just a quick aside that while I'm pushing all of this forward in terms of things that we can do, there's a whole host of other things that need to happen before we can actually make this, you know, use this data and share it with everybody so that we all benefit from it. So I just want to talk about 2 quick examples here about what can we do with this added data. And I'm going to talk just 2 examples here. One is short-term, you know, how can this help us in terms of short-term survey? So short-term survey timescales, e.g. predicting a habitat, or longer term in terms of looking at decadal variability using Earth system models. And so in the short term, you know, this additional data, and I'm just going to give an example of something that we've already done, is that, as I talked earlier, and I'm going back to the sardine example, we know that they spawn in the southern extreme of say, in the southern area of the West Coast, and then in the summer they extend further north. What we saw during the warm conditions of 2014, 15, 16 is that if you look at, and I forgot to mention, the white area here that looks like a cloud is actually what we did using data including chlorophyll and satellite images and so on and so forth to define what the optimum habitat is of the sardine spawning distribution. And based on that is where we would go send our ships to do the sampling. I'm jumping ahead. Historically, they've always spawned down here. And so we've designed our surveys to always start down here. In 2014, we went out here and there was none there. We got the call from the fishermen in Oregon saying, well, they're not there because they're up here. It's not that they're not there. And so when we redid this analysis to find the optimum habitat, I'm sorry I switched from white clouds to red clouds, what we saw was that in 2015 and 2016, the optimum habitat was not down here. It was actually further up north. And so what we did was use this information to shift the way that we do the surveys. And what we did was, if you only look at the right side of the panel here, using this optimum distribution, we actually shifted the sampling away from Southern California. So we didn't sample down here, and we moved up north. So, you know, by using some of this data, we can actually begin doing some adaptive sampling and actually make sure that the information that we catch or the capture is actually the correct information. And so this is a pretty simple example of adding more data to how we, say, adapt or how we incorporate, you know, the fact that there are changing conditions. The other one is a little bit harder because I want to talk about something, a work that it's actually almost a year old, if not longer. And that's work that Enrique Kirchitzer, Kenny Rose, and Jerome Fichter and others have done using a model that links from physics to fishing fleets. And so this is sort of an example of a mini example of an Earth system model. And the idea here is, so I'm going to show you what is it that these models can actually do. All right, the sort of the state of the art of of what models can do. And even though this is looking backwards in time, we're trying to reproduce things that happened in the past 50 years, that data was used to, quote, train the model so that we can now perhaps begin to look forward in time, holding your breath on a number of things that, the biology is going to remain the same and so on and so on and so forth. But this is just an example. This is just to give you a snapshot of where it is that these capabilities are as we try to really anticipate how the broader ecosystem is going to change. And it's going to focus on sardine and anchovy. That's the SAN of the NEMERO model. So it's NEMERO with sardines and anchovies. And as I said, it allows us to look at a couple of things. It says, if it's an Earth system model, we want to include not just the fact that the environment is changing, and that somehow the top-down, a bottom-up forcing that environment is changing, and that affects the structure of the ecosystem. But it also allows, the human aspect to come in, where it's a top-down forcing, where you actually have human impacts, in this case fishing fleets, actually coming in and interacting with your target population. And the idea is that you can then look and see what, is it temperature that's doing it? Is it the mesoscale features of the ocean circulation, or is there actually some changes associated with the fishing pressure or the fishing effort? And so our approach is to couple from quote, basic physics. So it's going from, looking at climate models that are forced by that are global scale, that we then downscale to, say, in this case, this is off the west coast of the United States. And then we couple that with biogeochemical models, lower trophic models that include various levels of phytoplankton, zooplankton, et cetera, that in turn are coupled with growth, production, mortality, movement of these fish through IBMs. So you got the lower trophic levels, and you got the fish individual-based models, and then in turn you have a fishing fleet model on top of it. So it really tries to integrate from one end to the other. And the idea is, I'm going to just go through some quick results. The point is that the models, where are we with these things? You can get anchovy biomass, and you can estimate catch per unit effort of different fishing fleets, whether they're located in different places, you get a whole lot of information. So the good thing about these models is that you get a wealth of information out of these things, and you can look at various life stages of the output. You can look at anchovy, sardine, eggs, yolk, sac, larvae, juveniles, adults, etc. You can look at this different, what emerges in terms of their different distributions. Behavior is something that is kind of, externally imposed, and so you kind of get what you put into the model. So these are things that we acknowledge we need to work on a little bit better. But you begin to see differences between species in response to different forcings. And by different forces, I'm talking about, a 50-year period where you have La Niñas, El Niños, PDOs, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at roughly what happens, the two anchovy and sardine, anchovy seems to have much higher variability. Sardine seems to have a lower variability. Remember, we were talking about, so some of these long-term decadal fluctuations. And you get many different wiggles all over the place. The question is, how do you extract some of this information from it? And the question then of these models, because they're complicated, it's almost the point of, we have too much data. Well, we have maybe too much model output. And so we try to do something here where, we try to find, whether it's biological processes, environmental conditions, or regional and climate scale forcings that we try to extract from this. And so what we did was we basically looked at what was determined to be the determining factor in sardine and anchovy, which have to do with age 1 growth and age 0 survival, where you looked at years that were good, and these are red, and years that were good in red and sardine, and the bad years that were in blue in terms of an anomaly of survival or growth, depending on what you look at. And you were then able to extract, relate those and look at the average of all the good years and average of the bad years, and what does that say about what the environment is doing? And the environment in this case is temperature, phytoplankton, zooplankton, eddy kinetic energy, et cetera, all kinds of things. And we find that in the case of where'd it go? Anchovy, sorry. You get higher growth during colder temperatures. During high levels of zooplankton, you get low growth during warm temperatures, and you get just the opposite in some cases, not always, but you get a different set of relationships between these environmental variables in the case of sardine. While the anchovy did better in cold, sardine do better in warm. And so again, you begin to say, okay, if we captured this in the past, can we begin to look forward in the future? And these are, again, using the data sets and the models in terms of how we go forward in what really is as I said before, perhaps a no analog state in terms of where, what our conditions are. So summarizing on the modeling side of things, we're happy with what we got. Clearly a lot of, assumptions and things to work on here. We talked a little bit about out-of-phase cycles, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But perhaps the bottom line is that we do need to work on biological realism, on climate projections, which are uncertain. But I think it's important to start thinking about this as we train these Earth system models and we go forward. So that's that part of why we need the data to collect and perhaps being able to bring this new understanding of where we're headed. And so now I'm moving to the last part of the talk, which is I'm going to have two quotes, one attributed to George Philander, which he said, models will be so good in the near future that data will be redundant. I really like that one. I figured you'd like that one.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I put that in there for you. He said that in the 1980s, and And then this one that you probably know, all of you must have seen it, In God We Trust, All Others Must Bring Data, by Edward Deming, somewhere in the 60s or something like that. So these are kind of two extremes, right? Models will be good enough that we don't need data, and the other one says, just bring the data, otherwise we ain't talking. And so the last couple of slides I wanted to talk about was, as I said, I wanted to wax a little bit philosophical about what data is. And I just wanted to start off by saying data are not truth. I know data is plural. So and that's me at the stake here for saying that. But the thing is, data are not truth. I mean, data are an approximation to truth. We don't know sometimes we measure the right quantities. What have we missed? We've all seen examples of size classes being missed because of mesh sizes and so on. Have we measured at the right temporal scales and so on? And I couldn't help it put this one in here. This is a Jeopardy thing, but it's called Facts Don't Matter. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. So it's talking about truth and getting there. Anyway, so the point here is a paper that we wrote back in 2009 with Dan Lynch and Dennis McGillicuddy, having to do with a discussion about skill assessment and models. And the point is that both observation and theory, data and model, if you want to call it that, are approximations of truth. So truth is out here somewhere, data and model are here, and there's errors associated with that measurement of truth. Okay. Now the error in the data and the error in the model arise for different reasons. And in fact, that measurement of truth between the error, the measured and the model data is something that we need to work with. And so, the error in the models perhaps arise because we start from imperfect theory towards truth estimation, numerical errors, et cetera, et cetera. Errors in data proceed the other way, come across the other way, where we try to look at truth, but we're looking at it through what we called an imperfect filter of the sampling method. But in both cases, you're approximating truth, or you're trying to get to truth. And so really the only thing you know is, and you can argue, well, data isn't just the measurement, but you also have to include the error associated with the measurement, but you don't really know the error because you don't know truth. The point is that in order to make predictions, these are discussions in data assimilation approaches and skill assessment of models as such, is that you have data and you have the model, and these are, you're trying to get towards the truth, and what you can do, the best that you can hope for, is your prediction to have some valid statistical basis, based on the statistics of the errors, which again, it's a little bit circular, but you need to work towards that best prediction in some way that you combine the measurements and the known statistics associated with the misfit between the model and the data. This made a lot of sense in 2009, but I've been in the government for too long, so things got a little bit hazy. But anyway, the point here I just wanted to say is as we get all of this data, as we use all of this data, we have to be careful with how we understand the errors associated with the data and the errors associated with the model, and how we say that is our approximation to truth. Okay, and so my last slide. So the question was something like, do we need data to help us get there? And I talked about, different ways of looking at different species and the kind of errors associated with it. And we covered a range from just simply not having it to not having access to it to, is it errors in, is it more information in processes or just in quantities? And also the idea that perhaps we could shift some of the efforts, given that the priorities that we have upon us, are probably shifting, whether it's food security or the matter that the Earth system is changing from underneath us. And the answer is, do we need data to help us get there? And I think I'm going to go back to my first slide, which is yes, no, maybe, depending on what the question is. So that was sort of a quick run through some of my thoughts. These are thoughts that are not done by any means. I need to work on this, and I'd be happy to get comments, including just delete the entire file and start all over again, which is an entirely valid comment. But with that, I'll just stop and I'll take any kind of questions that you might have.
Thank you, Cisco. We got time for a couple of questions. Yeah, Kelly.
You talked a lot about data that can be collected from vessels, research vessels, and a lot of oceanography, those types of things. And I'm assuming a lot comes from your background, but from the science center perspective, what about human dimension data that was mixed throughout your talk, as far as collect more data on fishermen, to count ecological knowledge, those types of things,
Right.
a little more about this.
Yeah. I think, without shirking the question, I'm not. I think Phil Levin probably touched upon that a little bit, and that was my point about the Earth system model, where we say we can't just look at the quote the ecosystem without the human aspect of it, which was, say, the fishing fleets, and it was just a simple example of including the fishing fleets in there. So I think that as we move forward in our models and our measurements, to do so without explicit inclusion of that human element is not going to work. And I think that I didn't talk about it because you guys know a lot more about this than I do. In the process of management strategy evaluations, I think that human element, the human dimension, comes in right at the beginning of the process, where objectives are laid out, and then the management strategy evaluations follow, trying to address what the different human dimension objectives might be, to the measurements, to the sampling strategies, et cetera, to the decisions that you make. So I'm fully agreeing with you that as we move forward in Earth system models, the next challenge is to really have the human dimension included as explicitly as possible, without, and not use the excuse that we need to understand more of the natural processes or more of the non-human dimension processes. So I'm not sure if I answered the question. I think I'm basically agreeing with you that this has to be part of the approach.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what data gaps may remain in understanding the historic and present day constellations of the species and techniques? And would numerical data be important?
Well, the anchovy-sardine oscillation, you know, it's the more you look into it, the more debated it is, you know, and so whether there is a real oscillation, I think it's even a matter of how you look at it. I mean, sometimes you even look at the if you look even at the very basic, if you look at the y-axis of the oscillation, the units are orders of magnitude different sometimes, and so there's a stretching in some of the plots where it looks like, oh, all this anchovy biomass has now been replaced by sardine biomass, and it's not clear to me whether you know, a lot of this data, which is based on landings, is actually just a representation of what the effort was towards particular species that were there. So I think that the sardine anchovy oscillation got a lot of attention. It made us think about a lot of things, but I think the closer we look at it, it's perhaps a result of a number of things that may not just simply be, you know, warm versus cold. And so looking at these you know, at the ecosystem models that hopefully, you know, will get better and better might actually tell us what may be needed to resolve that question of whether there really is an oscillation or not.
So if people are like debating whether or not data or data should be collected, what's the way to like minimize the same different people doing the same thing? Like I don't know how you would do this, but I feel like in medical field you have to like register your trial or like your study that you're doing so other people know. Would there be a way to do like something similar to that? So like as people are collecting more information, people aren't necessarily doing the same things.
Yeah, and that's you know, in some ways that's sort of the idea behind big data. I think that, you know, as we put all of our data and make it publicly available, I think we all learn from all the data that's been collected. I've seen some papers that very nicely illustrate, I think, in the medical field, as you said, you know, as all the data becomes available, you not only do you not do the same thing that other people have done, but you begin to extract and combine things in ways that you wouldn't have had that data not become available. So I think the answer to your question is that first, you know, the change in culture as we make all this data available, you know, and I just said that we face pretty big challenges given the amount of data that's going to be out there, and as we learn how to use all this data, how to convert all that data into information, we'll probably address the concern that you have that either we're duplicating efforts or doing things inefficiently. So I think that I don't know, maybe 5 years from now, when we've worked out some of the tricky aspects of how to deal with this amount of data, how to share it, how to transmit it, I think we will be in a very different position than we are now, because I think that this is the part of that I said earlier. It's very hard to be data poor. It's very hard to be data rich, and so this new approach, this new web, this new data IQ, increase of data IQ that we'll have will probably address that. So I'm optimistic that we're going to have a totally different view of how we use the data that's available in 5 years or so.
The last question to that, because otherwise I don't stop. I'll be like that professional.
So I was going to ask, so Andres quoted a quote, and I forget who you attribute to, that stock session models are always as complicated as can run overnight on a PC in the time that they're used. And
That's me.
okay, well, and you know, similarly, it seems like we only use the data that is from the last 20 years because as we develop new data collection methods, you know, best available science evolves and it becomes harder to bring in older forms of data that no longer meet the standards of the new data. And so I guess you know, so an example of this is when we start doing national collections and trawls, we throw out local sampling from the 50s or 20s and it brings out that whatever. So I'm curious, as you know, if you're pinning your hopes on advanced sampling technologies, I'm curious how you make sure that as we do that, we don't deprecate previous data that we have, you know, sets.
Right. So you're saying how not to completely supersede data that we may have that would be that would be good and useful because we just got caught up in the massive amounts of data that might be coming in. Well, I mean, there's you know, when I don't know enough about stock assessment models to talk about, you know, exactly how you would do it there, but if you were looking at, you know, say for example, data assimilative methods and so on that you would use in ocean circulation and atmospheric circulation, you would have some kind of an error estimate. You would kind of have a weighting, WAGHT weighting of the different data in terms of, you know, the various measures of the quality of the data. And I think that if you did that properly and if you properly weighted that data that, you know, was collected back then and you understood the value of it, you wouldn't lose it. You would keep it, and only once you weighted things differently would you lose that information, but that would have to be a conscious decision about you doing that. You wouldn't just subconsciously or you know, just do away with it willy-nilly. And I'm tempted to ask other people, but you said this was the last question. But I don't think we want to throw away any of the data, and we want to have some kind of an objective criterion by which you would keep the data or not.